And we are live. I have a really great pleasure to introduce Robert Rodriguez, who is the CEO and chairman for and founder for CNET. And I believe it's at least the top five most influential people in cybersecurity. Robert, thank you very much for joining us today, and much appreciated. I know you're a very busy guy, and I would love to start diving into your background. But before we do this, let me just say, and I mentioned that previously, is that I viewed a short intro by you from 2001, basically talking about the purpose of CNET, kind of the goal for the organization, and what you mentioned back then in 2001 is if not applicable, it's more applicable today than it was like 10 years ago, which is truly amazing.
Yeah, I actually kind of get emotional thinking about that as I reflect back. The messaging, the model, the formula, the culture, the branding has not changed. I would say the branding's changed. It's grown and it's become more respected and trusted. And it's been more influential in supporting our mission to advance innovation to defeat global cybersecurity threats. And what that really means is supporting early stage emerging growth companies, entrepreneurs, and innovators in the cybersecurity space and connecting their ecosystem. And when I talk about an ecosystem, if you would envision a wagon wheel, and in the middle of the wagon wheel is a hub, those contain companies, can be robotics, medical device, but in our world, it's all cybersecurity. Interchangeable, but the spokes that lead to the advancement of innovation are not interchangeable. They're necessary. Private equity, venture capital, if you're lucky to have an exit, investment banking, policy, those that are wise to collaborate with academia. I'm a big believer that when you have hard problems and you collaborate with people that are very talented and smart at universities is when you create your centers of excellence. You could add law firms. Companies mature and grow, they need protection, legal protection. You could even add real estate. As Google started off University Avenue in Palo Alto out of the apartment, and Facebook and others, they've grown. They need that office space. But most important within the ecosystem are the buyers from industry and government, your CSOs, your CISOs, your CIOs, your chief information risk officers, et cetera. They're really the most important entity within the ecosystem. And within the ecosystem, I only focus on three things. I want to know every buyer in the world. I want to know the entrepreneurs. And lastly, the investors. And I do believe that as long as you have a trusted Rolodex and relationship with those three entities, you pretty much have everything. And the reason I focus on the buyers is because if I really want to support the mission and help the entrepreneur, I must have trust with the buyers. And if you throw COVID on top of pre-COVID, it was hard to get to the buyers. They're deleting emails and phone calls. COVID comes along and you can't get to the buyer, especially if you're a young company. And they're most important. It doesn't matter what investors invest in or what entrepreneurs build. I believe that it's the buyer. They're the ones that drive the markets, the revenues, the valuations, and the opportunity for exits.
Yeah, absolutely. And what's amazing is that back in 2007, when you founded CNET, I mean, the cybersecurity wasn't a kind of a board discussion at all. It was considered as a cost center. The dynamics between the buyers and the companies and the startups and ecosystem as a whole was very different, right? So, what made you decide to create this organization? How come you saw this need like way back when in 2007?
Well, two things. Let me first address your point. You're absolutely right. The continuing evolution of the 21st century CISO, moving from that cost center, as you stated, a blue collar security person, Dr. No, Very rarely, if ever, reported to the board of director, probably more to the CIO or COO or CFO. No standardization of reporting structure, even to this day with the risk executive. To today's risk executive, who's briefing the board on a quarterly basis, if not more, that is a person that is maybe less technical, but understands the importance of business and is seen as a driver enabler of business enterprise wide, that is articulating complex matters in a business risk sense to their board and CEO, and sometimes sitting on boards.
Yeah, absolutely. And I have so many questions to ask you. I'm hoping I'm going to be able to wrap it all in kind of cohesive type of interview session. So let me touch upon one thing. Uh, you are very much in tune in terms of what's happening in the cybersecurity startup ecosystem. And at least from my perspective, I've seen these kind of waves of adoption of security technologies almost diminishing in time. If, for example, companies have acquired firewalls and then maybe potentially mobile endpoint security, these cycles of adopting security is becoming, condensed, in which really is challenging both from the enterprise perspective, these buyers, because they work on cycles that are fairly long from an adoption and acquisition perspective. And then from the startup perspective as well, they have to very quickly go to market with a product that's appealing. What's your take on kind of the statement that I've made in terms of like the diminishing lifespan of these cycles?
Well, it's the continuing evolution of life in business. I mean, the big driver in the last 2 years was shift left, but shift with caution, the digital transformation journey. And it opened up this whole world of DevSecOps, app governance, app security. Greater visibility is a really important word to the buyer, to the people that are protecting critical infrastructure, and greater automation, real-time detection, supply chain risk management. It, I would say that the vulnerability footprint has increased as a result of this transformation. And so your market has changed. I mean, everything from Uber Eats to Zoom to CrowdStrike to those that are in that space, the work from home environment, accelerated. Other entities like hotels and airlines and the travel industry, et cetera, they had problems. So a lot of things are unexpected, and for some can be a boom.
Yeah, absolutely. I couldn't agree more. I think that there's definitely increase in the speed of velocity even in businesses in general because of we move
Mhm.
into this digital transformation. Now let's talk about kind of the three pillars, right? The buyer you mentioned, the kind of designer and the entrepreneurs, and then the investment side of the house. So let's talk a bit about the buyer. So the buyer persona has really changed as well, right? So, and then the way they purchase technologies, the way they get themselves smarter about technologies also change, right? Uh, as you mentioned, if you could reach a CISO, back in 2010, maybe with a cold email, today it's almost impossible. What do you find? The biggest challenge for these entrepreneurs to today to trying to reach the buyer and get them engaged in a meaningful conversation.
I just, I say this all the time. My wife and I run Signet. We mentor companies constantly. I speak to companies and CEOs and
Mhm.
sales and marketing people every single day. I talk at a minimum with 3 to 20 CISOs a week.
Well,
I've learned more in the last year and a half or so because of the amount of Zoom calls and not being on an airplane and having quality time in the sense that's virtual, but it's been highly informative for me. But for the entrepreneur, build a connection, build a relationship, build trust. period. These emails and texts and phone calls, the money spent on that is, when I talk to the CISOs and the risk executives, they say that's throw it in the trash. You're just not going to get to them. They're deleting it all. They're doing trust-based referral with their colleagues in the industry who they respect and trust. It's hard to do what I'm saying, but old school metrics and the way marketing people have conducted business is going away, and they need to innovate. It's really all about relationships more than ever, and they need to pivot and think about how they, I mean, think of some of the emails that we get from people. It's unbelievable, the lack of, I think, respect. And a lot of the CMOs and marketing people are hurting the brand of the CEO and the company. I know CISOs have told me that I don't care how good that product is, I'll never take a meeting with that company.
Yeah, and why is that, do you think? I mean, I agree with you, but I want to kind of dig a little further into
Sure.
that
It's
process.
the annoyance, I think, that they feel, the lack of respect that they feel, the overabundance of 4 to 5,000 global vendors, and it's caused them to be aggressive and tactics to be unsavory. And so it's made them recluse.
So, as you mentioned, it's easier said than done. How do you build that trust over time? And this is something that it takes more than than a single email or a single presentation. It's something that takes a while, and a lot of these entrepreneurs are under pressure, especially if they received
Mhm,
funding to perform on a quarterly basis in order for them to get to the next round, and potentially, make an exit with the company. So it's almost they're between the rock and a hard place. Building trust is something that it's a longer term process,
mhm.
but then they're working on a potentially monthly and quarterly goals.
Yeah. So we're going to back up a little bit in time. I know certain salespeople that no matter where they go, if they call the CISOs, they take the meeting. And it's because they have pre-existing trusted relationship. There's a connection. There's a real relationship. The challenge again is COVID happens, and for early stage companies, they probably have a limited family and friends Rolodex and venture Rolodex that can only go so far. And so they got caught in a hard spot, because how do you build a relationship in a COVID world? It's really hard to replace the warm handshake, right? And as we get back to live events, I would encourage them to align themselves with respected conferences that have the right people at the right level, those that have a lot of the buyers in the room, I would call buyers, CISOs, and try to stay away from conferences where there's nothing to, I'm not trying to disrespect a retired general or a consultant, but they don't have P&L. And at the end of the day, once a company raises the capital, especially in today's environment, they only care about one thing, and that is getting to the buyer. And so it's almost one handshake at a time. It's like that old, I think, Merrill Lynch commercial years ago. One handshake at a time. That's how I built Signet, to be honest with you, over
Mhm.
20 years.
Yeah, it's an incredible story. So let's talk a bit about the explosion of a number of vendors. You mentioned the 45,000 vendor mark, which is tremendous. And again, this is nothing that was like back in 2007 or 2010 for that matter. And what do you see, like, in terms of industry? Like, is this sustainable to have that many vendors for this type
Mhm,
of industry? Are we
mhm,
looking at some sort of consolidation? Because there's that, and then there's also these tremendous valuations for company that don't
mhm.
necessarily have. And you're smiling because you know where I'm going with this. They don't necessarily have the revenue to back it up.
Well, I think it's 4 to 5,000 vendors. I'm not really
Okay,
sure how many.
4 to 5. That's right.
Uh, so we've been talking about consolidation for a while, and it's happening. It's happening. If you look at the M&A, the first 6 months of this year, just in cybersecurity alone, it's about $51.6 billion. And in terms of capital investment, it's about 11.4 billion. This market is so robust, and it's caused the valuations to, I think, be unhealthy. I'm a venture capitalist at Sinewave Ventures, and I know companies 85x a purchase. I'm not going to say who and what. An A round of 280 million. It's in the public. A and B round within 18 months for a startup of 85 million. We can go on and on, right? So, yes, there's some consolidation, but I think the amount of attacks and the sophistication of the attacks and the increased vulnerability footprint, and now we're into the ransomware, now extortion, as just and the geopolitics of moving from a globalization environment to a populist and nationalism, and looking at the South China Sea and Taiwan, huge chip maker, we're shortage of supply chain, in particular chips, cars and computers, and many other entities are having a hard time getting these things. And you look at what's happened in Hong Kong and the China and India border, South China Sea, et cetera. There's a lot of complicated matters happening, and it's increasing the severity of our politics globally. Russia, China, Iran, North Korea. And so the state of affairs of protecting our respective nations' critical infrastructures and our national security and economic interests and our inherent rights as a free citizen in a free democracy, to include our right to privacy, is at risk. And what does that mean? Cyber is in the middle of everything. I believe cyber is really the only entity that touches everything and has become like the air we breathe. And so its importance at board of director meetings, at national security levels, at government levels, at critical infrastructure levels, is at a high point, and I think even moving forward higher.
Yeah, and it's incredible. What do you think is driving these tremendous, valuations and investments? I mean, while the
Mhm.
barriers of entry kind of gone down, I mean, if you had to have physical servers and create like spin off an infrastructure back in 2005, 2010, today you can have a bunch of developers, maybe overseas, and outsource that function and spin off a bunch of AWS servers, and you're off to the races with a fairly limited investment. What's driving these hundreds of millions worth of investment, and where does this money go into what? And do you think that's a wise way to advance the whole cybersecurity space as a whole?
One of the big reasons is there is a ton of capital. There is so much capital out there. And when you have a lot of capital, you're not as frugal. Then you throw on the threat that I just mentioned, which is high, and every year it seems to go higher. And the records of M&A and venture and private equity investments increases every year. You have to think back, just think about private equity. Warburg Pincus invested 25 million in an A round in CrowdStrike. I believe it was 2012. It's the first time I ever heard of private equity, which is a growth, late stage entity investor. Now there's many private equity firms investing in early stage emerging companies, which is interesting because then you see Excel creating a growth fund, right? Which was really venture, but it's covered now. They're covering all gamuts of the investment cycle, from seed to early stage to A, B, C, D, E, late stage. And then you have venture firms that are just focused entirely on cybersecurity, and they're very successful. If you look at Jay Leak, who was CISO at Blackstone, he was actually really a VC slash CISO, made some of the smartest investments when he was there with Cylance and Phantom and Demisto. Then he goes to Clear Sky, huge success there. Then he creates his own new fund with Patrick Heim, Sin Ventures. You got Bob Ackerman, another successful venture capitalist with Data Tribe and Allegis Capital. You got Alberto Yepes, Forge Point, Alex Dole at 1011. Wing does multiple ventures, but they are also highly successful in cyber. Ted Schlein at Kleiner, Ashim at Greylock. I mean, I could go on and on. There are some luminaries in the investment world that have had great success, and a lot of it is it's like luck sometimes with the drivers in the marketplace, the pain.
Right. They are spreading the risk, though. I think that they're investing in several companies, and then, one or two successes pay for all the other, failures and so on. Um,
Right.
in your opinion, these investors, what are they currently looking at? So aside from, typically the typical thing is to solve a big problem, right? You want to solve a large problem. We all know cybersecurity has large problems to solve. But then what other type of criteria they're looking for? And I'm talking about from an investment standpoint.
So one of the things I do during my interviews with the CISOs, I ask them, if you were a venture capitalist or an entrepreneur starting a company, what would you invest in or what would you build? And lately I've been hearing supply chain risk management, the whole ecosystem of application security, DevSecOps, governance, and due again to the digital transformation journey that we're all on. Either we're there, have been there, or we're in the middle, or we're thinking about it and we're going to get there. So those are some of the words that I hear.
And isn't it interesting when we're talking about supply chain risk? There are tools in place that's been around for a long time that companies use, maybe unsuccessfully, or at least they've been around for a long time, and they use it at some capacity. And it's almost like the kind of the passwordless thing where companies have been talking about, or for 25 years, and we're still not there, even though we're making some progress. There's a lot of these areas where it seems like innovation is slow to happen, even the supply chain area, right? What's causing that? Why are we still facing the same exact problem we faced 10, 15 years ago?
You just stole the words out of my mouth. I've been saying this and thinking this for a long time. And what's come to the realization for me is the amount of complexity. Like, for example, with application security, DevSecOps. In fact, I was at a workshop at West Point around 2011, 2012, maybe. Director of NSA, General Alexander, was there speaking, and he said, applications are the Achilles heel. The Achilles heel. And I thought about that. And then I'm wondering, why isn't this fixed? I mean, we can go back to Spy Dynamics and Sensic, Fortify, cradle to grave, trying to fix this problem. But the continuing dynamics of misconfigurations, because we all change and grow in life to include software, that it's so complex. And there's a whole ecosystem that one bullet can't fix. Then if you talk about supply chain risk management, vendor, there are so many entities touching a company's infrastructure, from services and products, and remove vendors 2-3 off, that it's just very, very difficult. Now you have to think about the birth of the internet. 1966 October, UCLA sends it was, I think, ARPANET then, message to SRI International. We are very embryonic in our state of affairs. This is not an old space. In 1609, the Dutch created the laws of sea. It's taken hundreds of years. It's still not solved, really. If you look at what's happening in South China Sea with the discussion and disagreement on who owns that pathway, you got Vietnam and Japan and China and the Philippines. I would say just a lot of complexities. And I would also add that the investors are also partly to blame in a way. I mean, software is a great investment. The margins are wonderful. But I think if you really need to fix and want to fix the problem, you need to invest in firmware and hardware. I kind of view it like the foundation of a house. And you have termites and there's holes and you're putting putty and gum to patch those holes. You need a strong, robust foundation of steel beams of hardware for that house to grow and build on. And we haven't made those investments.
Yeah, and I think that's absolutely a matter of national security, and I think we're working towards fixing that. But you're right, because a lot of these fundamental chips are not made here in the U.S., which can cause some concerns to say the least. And the firmware is something we don't have visibility into as well.
Mm-hmm.
And then I think you touched upon complexity. Complexity is ever increasing. So in the supply chain, companies are outsourcing all the non-essential functions, which makes it even more complex. And then for software applications now are not standalone either. Every application is siphoning out like information and through APIs through like 10 other applications, 15, 20, 30 applications.
Mm-hmm.
And so the complexity is exponentially growing. And I think that's part of the problem of not being able to fix that. What technologies are exciting when you look at kind of the marketplace? And you mentioned these areas, but there's also, the sky's not falling. We're making progress on a monthly, yearly basis from areas of machine learning, AI, building behavioral type of baseline to diminish the human element and so on. What type of technologies do you see now that have a great potential to increase kind of the state of affair of security in terms of enterprise?
So I mentioned some of them earlier: greater visibility, greater automation, real-time detection, greater governance, something that can help orchestrate all the complexities of the environment and connect that ecosystem and make sense and prioritize the data that is most important to those ladies and gentlemen that are protecting the companies and our governments.
Absolutely. And so let's talk a bit about Signet and its activities. So you mentioned you've kind of just rebranded a little bit in the past several years. How do you make that connection between, as you mentioned, these kind of three pillars: the buyers, the investors, and then the entrepreneurs? And how do people, these entities gain? What kind of benefits they gain from being part of the organization?
So we pivoted. Our last live event was in London, pre-COVID, January, and our CISO board of director workshop, which is specifically for risk executives in Scottsdale at the Four Seasons. We do bring in 10 entrepreneurs to pitch. They cannot go to the workshop because we're constantly protecting the buyers. I do take over a restaurant one night and we have a reception and dinner. And it's because the culture is known and trusted. It's a very comfortable conversation with the entrepreneurs and the CISOs. It's extremely relaxed and it's trusted. And to have a comfortable conversation, there has to be an element of trust. And what we did is my wife, Heather, pivoted and built a highly curated, invitation-only marketplace or platform connecting the investor, the buyer, and the seller. So when I made my opening remarks, I talked about the ecosystem, but I talked about the three entities that I focus on because that's what I believe that is the most important within the ecosystem. And we had our most successful year, even though we canceled all our events.
Yeah, amazing.
And we have about 57 CISO risk executives who are paying members. We have 3 venture capital firms, and we have about 46 companies, everything from CrowdStrike, Gigamon, Cloudflare, public companies to emerging growth companies. And then we discount for the early stage companies that have raised under 5 million. And we've always taken care of the young company over the years at our live events and conferences with the sponsorship levels, knowing that it's tough to start a business.
Yeah, absolutely. And I would like to talk a bit about what you see currently from a regulatory environment. There seems to be a push, and there was a push for in the past couple of years, and we seem like to gather regulations, whether it's GDPR, whether it's privacy and so on. How do these businesses are like? How does that affect from all these three pillars, like the investor side, the entrepreneurs, as well as those CISOs? There's a lot of kind of overhead in terms of doing business, in terms of being compliant to all those regulatory requirements.
Mm-hmm. Well, you can start with your banking and finance and energy companies, very highly regulated, down to companies that are less regulated. I'm not a big fan of regulation like many people, but I think there's some elements of regulation as the severity of the environment increases that we may have to have some form of regulation. If you look at what NIST has put out and the executive orders out of the White House, and I'm very proud to say that I know numerous government leaders, to include the Secretary of Homeland Security, Secretary Mayorkas, who's keynoted at our Silicon Valley in New York event when he was the Deputy Secretary at DHS, and is a huge supporter of cybersecurity. Then you have Ann Neuberger at the National Security Council, Chris Inglis at the White House, Jen Esterly at CISA, Rob Silver running policy for DHS for AustCyber, and Rob Joyce, who took Ann's spot at NSA. Unequivocally, we have the most mature, seasoned, experienced government cyber executives that we've ever had. And I'm very excited about this change over the administrations going back several years. So a lot of confidence in that leadership, and them also understanding, coming from industry like Jen has, regulation is a double-edged sword in respecting that position.
Yeah, absolutely. And then if we look at again the session you had in 2001, you talk about on 1 million unfulfilled cybersecurity positions, and yet we're 10 years after, and it seems to be again a topic of discussion, kind of the lack of talent, which is it's more than just the lack of talent. I think it's a matter of national security. We have to have people in STEM to join the kind of the battle in cybersecurity and contribute as a nation to something we need to do. So where is the gap, and why are we still, again, 10 years later, we're still in the same spot we were 10 years ago?
Well, there's a couple of things. I think the complexities has driven the need for human resources and financial resources for companies to do their job to protect their brand and IP, et cetera. And I think that if we followed a model that Israel had implemented years ago, that we would have greater success in fulfilling these jobs. So what they did is they had mandatory courses in high school for cyber, and started at age 16. But they lowered it to age 14. And the reason they did that is because the women were more mature than the men and already knew at age 14 the profession they wanted to pursue: doctor, lawyer, engineer, whatever. And when they did that, they increased their cyber pool. Then you think about the mandatory requirement to serve in the military and those that choose to go to 8,200. And then the amount of companies that have come out of there as or people that have come out of there that have started companies like Rob Grease at Psycognito and many, many others.
Yes, staggering,
Um,
amazing.
it's so impressive. And when I went to Israel, I've been there 3 or 4 times. And the first time I went, I was at Cyber Tech Week. Amir Rappaport runs that. He invited me, and I think I spoke that year. But when I walked around the vendor showroom, I was highly impressed with the amount of startups, but more so the amount of diversity in the solution and the approach with their solution. It was unlike anything I had seen in America or any other countries. And I think the the life of living 24/7 on an island of sand with constant threat drives innovation. It drives a different way of succeeding. It drives a different way of winning, a different way of thinking, because there are no options for failure for a country that small. So the amount of talent that is driven out of that type of philosophy has created some of the greatest companies in cybersecurity. In fact, I remember emailing Admiral Rogers when he was director of NSA at the time that I just left the cyber epicenter of the world, Tel Aviv.
Yeah, it's what did they say? Necessity is the mother of invention. I think that's basically sums it up. Um,
Or
it,
when you have pain or limited budgets or where you have stress on the metal is when you innovate at your greatest.
yeah, absolutely. Um, and so somebody I heard said that we are in a quote unquote like Cold War from a cybersecurity perspective, and there's always a constant threat on SCADA systems, infrastructure, and so on. What's your take on that statement?
I agree to that. I have strong positions on what's going to happen with us in China and what's been going on with Russia and us. I totally agree with that. We are in a Cold War.
So, what are we doing to? I mean, we have to protect ourselves. I think we're moving in the right direction, but we're this is something that started a while back, and being a nation this size, it takes a while for us to build, kind of the controls and defense forces to basically to protect yourselves. So, in your mind, are we doing a good job, or where potentially where can we end up, if we don't?
Well, listen, I don't work at Department of Defense. I don't work in the government anymore. I can only read what I read. But when the chief software scientist at Department of Defense leaves because of his grave concern and disappointment of the lack of innovation and movement forward at Department of Defense, and I read other things that you probably have read. I'm not going to go into all that. And the amount of money, I think $1 trillion that China's investing in AI is frightening. If you think about AI, it's the more data you have, the greater chance of having more sophisticated, viable AI. And China has a lot of people, and they've got their tentacles into third world countries, laying pipe, undercutting Cisco via Huawei, and the amount of data they're getting and alliances with certain countries is concerning. And I think we are behind the 8 ball in terms of our investments and traction with AI. And I believe that whoever dominates artificial intelligence will dominate military and economic prosperity, and hence the world.
Yeah, absolutely, and I agree, and I think China also has the advantage that they are generating their own data as well, because their privacy concerns are not there as much as it is here. So they have a lot of, for example, camera collecting data on a regular basis, and on citizens and so on. So the AI can be fed with much larger quantities of data than can happen here. Um, and and then what's your take on like things like quantum computing, which we hear all the time that potentially can break the internet, encryption, and so on? Do you hear any startups in that space that are doing some work?
Yes, I do. And a friend of mine, Professor Dan Bonet at Stanford, is a phenomenal professor. I met him and John Mitchell when I started the Electronic Crimes Task Force with another agent, moved to San Francisco from DC when I was in the Secret Service on December 18, 2001. But I asked him about a year ago or so his thoughts on quantum and where we were and how close. And his opinion was that it's still a while off. It's not in the next 3 to 5 years, maybe 10. I don't, but it's not immediate. And those companies in that space are probably a little early because the buyer has so many challenges and needs that they have to prioritize. And for the entrepreneur, they need to find out to understand the market that the product that they're building, the solution they're building is not in the nice to have bucket. That is not going to move the needle. They need to be in the must or need to have bucket.
Yeah, and it's amazing that there are companies that do quantum computing, but yet there are brand new companies that just are starting out and they're tackling email security, which is email security is a problem that was quote unquote being solved like 10, 15 years ago,
Mm-hmm.
and already done with. At least most organizations have solved the problem, but there's still yet I guess there's more to come. Um, Listen, it's been a real pleasure, Robert. I feel like we can continue this conversation and dive a little deeper into some other topics, and I think we should do that. And then also, I would love to host you in New York. I know you used to come previously when you used to host the SciNet events in New York City. And there was a cyber tech event, by the way, in New York City not long ago,
Mm-hmm.
hosted by Amir Rappaport as well. But love to host you. And then, what's the easiest way for people to get hold of you, to reach out, to be members of SciNet and be part of this wonderful ecosystem you built?
Well, thank you. Security Innovation Network is SciNet.
Hmm.
So you can Google SciNet, SINET, or you could email me at rdrodriguez, that's RODRIGUEZ, at security-innovation.org. I have been in New York a lot lately. We did cancel all the events, but I hosted a dinner for 55 CISOs and CEOs of small companies and VCs in New York in July. I did a dinner in DC for Jen Esterly, the new director of CISA, and we had 45 CISOs and government executives and entrepreneurs and CISOs in the room. And I just spoke with the Secretary of Homeland Security the other day, and he was going to come to a dinner in New York, but he had to cancel for December. So we're working on another date for springtime in New York. I'm a big believer in supporting Allie and Jen and Rob Silver and the others because of my passion for public-private partnerships. I can't say how important they are, and more important today that that the industry support those and support our government leaders. They're working very hard. They've got a very hard job, but it takes that whole ecosystem that I mentioned to have success. And the seriousness of the threat, as we mentioned earlier, is only increasing.
Absolutely, Robert. And I wanted to thank you for your contribution to the cybersecurity space. It's really tremendous. And thank you for taking the time to talk to me, today in the group, and helping participate in such an engaging conversation. Much, much appreciated. Again, thank you all for joining us today. Looking forward to seeing you at the next event. And Robert, thank you again, and looking forward to hopefully seeing you in New York City sometime.